Our first lecture today will be given by Kosta Bovan, and the title is Cultural Trauma and Comic Books, etc.
etc. Yeah. Okay, so the floor. Thank you. Okay, so good morning, everyone. First of all, I think I will talk a bit more than I could chew. I don't think I will be able to present all three of the comic books. When I started, it sounded like I could, but I think I will be like half an hour more. So I'll just go, and I think the first two will be in the 45 minutes, and then I think I'll manage to present the third one. I'll start with two quotes. I call them inspirational quotes, but maybe not for you. They were inspirational for me, even though they're not so positive, let's say. So Daniele, in his introduction to the handbook of transgenerational trauma, he said, in the past, multi-generational the transmission has been treated as a secondary phenomenon, perhaps because it is not as obvious or dramatic as the horrific images of traumatized people. The mind recalls when viewing such images, and it does not take in that children not yet born could inherit a legacy, and memories not of their own, but that nevertheless will shape their lives. It is bad enough to see images of children victimized today, that the same images may shape the lives of generations to come, sometimes unconsciously, often by design, is even harder to comprehend and accept. So that was like my inspiration, or something that's been bothering me a lot, or something that I wanted to work a bit on, this transgenerational trauma. On the other hand, comics, why not? It's something that I enjoy, and I find this quote from Edward Said's introduction to Joe Sacco's Palestine, a comic book about Palestine-Israeli conflict and so on. He says, in ways that I still find fascinating to decode, comics, in their relentless foregrounding, far more say than film cartoons or funnies, neither of which matters much to me, seem to say what couldn't otherwise be said. Perhaps that wasn't permitted to be said or imagined, define the ordinary processes of thought, which are policed, shaped, and reshaped by all sorts of pedagogical as well as ideological pressures. I knew nothing of this then, but I felt that comics freed me to think and imagine and see deeper. So these are two strands, let's say, of quotes that started, that put me down this path, and then I found a couple of comics that deal with these issues. And today I'll try to present a bit about transgenerational trauma, specifically of transgenerational perpetrator trauma, and I'll try to present something about general, let's say, theory of comic books, and then we'll move to the comic books themselves. So transgenerational transmission of trauma, it was primarily studied by acknowledging that children of Holocaust survivors were traumatized themselves by experiences not fully their own, and thus not fully known. Even though they deal with these feelings or traumas in various ways, from silence to self-inflicting, self-hurting, or identification with victims or perpetrators, to less extreme ones, like confronting the trauma via arts or literature. Paradoxically, Maus, maybe not paradoxically, but Maus had an enormous impact on studying the trauma. It was one of the, let's say, one of the inspirations, or one of the focal points of Marianne Kirsch's work on post-memory. I kind of felt like, we can discuss this later if this is correct, that Maus was, and maybe is seen as an aberration in comic books. I think comic books dominantly are still viewed in the mainstream, let's say, as low culture. They're superheroes, Marvel, and so on. Maus really changed that. I'll talk a bit about the history shortly. But I would say in the last couple of years, maybe a decade, there have been a lot of comics that worked with trauma and that were seen as dealing with serious issues. Alison Bechdel or Marianne Satrapi or Joe Sacco, these are just authors that use the comic book form to discuss autobiographical traumas or conflicts all around the world. And of course, there have been, in the last 5 years, many academics published work discussing this relation between comics and memory, witnessing war, violence, and so on. Hilary Schultz, Earl, Ravello Chodar, Ahmed Crucifix, Davis, and Rifkin. These are all from 2016 to 2020. So these are all relatively new topics that have been discussed. And I will focus in this talk probably on two comic books, Nora Krug's Heimat, the German family album from 2018, and Serena Katz Sunday's Child from 2019. If I have time, but I don't think I will, we can discuss later about Nina Bunjeva's father and the family history. Sorry for promising something that won't be able to fulfill. Okay, so when we move to transgenerational trauma, I want to delve into, because we had a lot of talks about the collective cultural and individual trauma, the relationship by at least Sean and Ron, but there were others also. But what was interesting to me is this added layer of familial trauma, or trauma within the family. I could not see the way that cultural trauma and individual trauma are maybe not connected with the familiar one, but what are the dynamics between those? Because if you look at the cultural, for example, if you look at the collective narratives, they are usually in line with the familiar narratives about certain traumatic experiences, but sometimes they are not. You have counter narratives, individual family stories that maybe do not fit in with the collective narrative of certain situations that can happen. So I was interested in how can I use, is there a theoretical framework, is there a way of thinking about this relationship with the individual, the family, and the collective? And one of the work that was really inspiring again to me was Gabrielle Schwab's idea of haunting legacies. So Gabrielle Schwab works, and she expands the idea of Abraham and Torok, the idea of the crypt and the haunting phantom, crypt and the phantom, and then later with the haunting. So what is she talking about? Where first, the idea is that when an individual is faced with an unspeakable experience, it could be extreme violence or whatever, war or stuff like that, we bury it in a psychic crypt. It's a burial place, so this is quote, it's a burial place inside the self for a loved object that is lost but kept inside the cell like a living corpse. So basically what she's saying, or what Abraham and Torok are saying, that we bury this experience, we keep it silent because we didn't have a chance to mourn over what we have lost, be it our innocence, our family, loved ones, and so on. It doesn't matter what the content is. So the silence that comes after the unspeakable experience, it's usually seen as adaptive. So it's something that we can step away from the experience itself, and it should allow us to later, when the experience is a bit not so engaging, work through it and try to look at it. However, what can happen if the silence is just a second. If the silence persists for too long, if we are silent about that experience for too long, or if that silence is so broad, we create a phantom, or we create the content of the psychic crypt becomes alive and it haunts us like a ghost. So the silence the silence makes the walls to be unbreakable, let's say, and the content actually is kept alive even though we did not confront it. So what can be done? So Abraham and Torok, or Gabrielle Schwab, she says, okay, there are two things. One is this silence that, so we are in forever, let's say forever haunted by this ghost, by this unspeakable experience, or we can, through mourning, try to break the crypt and either interject or integrate such experiences into our identity or our let's say, self. So this happens on an individual level. But however, what happens is also that the lack of mourning and the crypt building influences other people. If we have our own crypt, our way of dealing with our past or our experiences also transports into the way that we deal with other people. And this is especially seen in parents dealing with their children. So what happens is that the silence goes on to haunt the children unconsciously in the form of phantoms. They inherit, and now this is the quote, they inherit psychic substances, the next generation, of their ancestors' lives which they did not experience themselves. So we are basically traumatized by experiences which are not our own. And this traumatization works by two ways. One way is the way that the parent has his or her own crypt, is depressed, is silenced, feels the grief and guilt, and that their way of handling it affects their interaction with the children. So if you are depressed, if your parent is depressed, it will affect your coming of age and your socialization and so on. But the other way that this silence causes the children is once they learn about the actual events, about what is inside the crypt. So these are two ways that the next generation is actually affected by experiences of their parents that are unspeakable and buried inside the crypt. And what happens is that usually children erect their own crypts, because sometimes their parents or their relationship with the parents is so traumatizing that they build up walls of their own. And then if they want to discuss or find a way to fix, that's not a good word, but work through, for example, their own walls, their own crypts in their relationship with their parents, they are confronted with an additional crypt of the original, let's say, traumatic experiences of their parents. So this is just shortly, but what's interesting about Schwab's work is that she adds three layers, let's say. First, she says that the crypt phantom, this dynamic that we talked about in the individual and familial level, also works at the collective and the cultural level. And she says this quote, in violent histories, the personal is inseparable from the collective and the political. So basically, this means that the cultural and political level, there can be certain topics that are not talked about, kept secret within a collective crypt, which turns to cultural or national haunting for next generation. She has, of course, post-war Germany in front of her. Second, this is a general addition, but I think it's really important. Facing facts is not enough. So if you know the content of the crypt, if you know what happened, like merely stating facts, I was confronted with violence, so many people died, and so on, it is not enough. In order to break the crypt, you have to have emotional engagement, you have to mourn, you have to feel, let's say, the experience. It's not merely that you're faced with facts and then, okay, I know what happened, that's enough, the crypt is broken, it's not haunting us anymore. We need to address responsibility, guilt, shame, and what she calls the psychosocial deformation of the culture at large. We need to mourn regardless of our status in the event itself. Finally, and this is probably the most controversial, maybe ethically dubious position, is that even perpetrators are traumatized. That's her position. Of course, they are traumatized differently, and but that doesn't mean that the next generation cannot be haunted by both intrapsychic and collective phantoms. So, side note, I mentioned here that I'm not dealing with trauma of perpetrators, even though I'm dealing with the children of perpetrators, but it follows several risks. Of course, there's always the risk of equivalence of the perpetrator and the victim, downplaying the atrocities, revisionism, increasing empathy toward the perpetrator, which is very important in comic books that are very good at, let's say, to induce empathy, let's say. Even portraying the perpetrators as victims, there are various ethical problems with this, I would say. But I always ask myself, what is our goal? Why are we studying these issues? I would argue that it is to take responsibility for atrocities, acknowledge the victims, the work toward, but also work toward an integrated collective psyche and better relations among past perpetrators and victims, or even the next generation of perpetrators and victims. In that case, if we want to build a better collective, I think we need to work with perpetrators, especially children of perpetrators, who had no role in the violence itself. So returning to the perpetrator, I will probably skip through this, but Schwab works on the post-war German generation, where she says the next generation is stuck somewhere between knowing and not knowing, belonging and not wanting to belong, that mark their psychic life. And she says that it's an interesting situation in which the crypt itself was not silenced in a factual way. We had politics of acknowledgement, Nuremberg trials, official politics of reparation, and so on. But in the end, it wasn't worked through in an emotional or mourning way. Children perpetrators did not have let's say, situation where they could mourn their past or their ancestors and so on. So I'll just skip to this, but the idea is what can be done? How can children do this? Well, first of all, and that's I think a big, what's the word? We have big expectations of this next generation. Is that they need to address the unfinished business of their parents if they didn't do it, and only then they have the agency to confront the past by themselves. So it's easier said than done, of course. But one way to do this is through arts and literature. McLaughlin says that children of survivors and perpetrators, they take up writing, begin to reconnect to unknown experience that has indelibly marked their lives. This is, of course, in line with Hirsch's idea of post-memory, which is an amalgam of memory with the generational distance and history personal connections. But still, how can we try to represent the unrepresentable trauma? Well, one way I think if we can try to do this is, of course, the upcoming books. Now we'll go to the next part. Okay, so comics, a relatively new art form. This is from a theoretical book, Understanding Comics by McLeod. This is the theoretical definition, juxtaposed Victorian and so on and so on. So the comics really started in the 1930s from Europe, USA, later in Japan to gain mainstream acceptance. But there were always this underground comics, especially in the 60s, that used the art form to expand, to work on issues like feminism, anti-war topics, and so on. And it was in the mainstream in 1986 with Watchmen and Batman and the Dark Knight Returns that they gained a bit more, let's say,
recognition.
Yes, thank you, recognition. But it wasn't until 1992 with the publishing of Klaus II that comics really started to be seen as a way of being able to handle really hard topics, let's say. So, but what is it about comics that makes them, especially in comparison to other art forms? Well, just a couple of things that I think are interesting or important for trauma. First, comics, like no other art form, invite the reader as an active participant. We are asked unconsciously to be a part of the narration itself, to give it meaning and continuity. For example, these are two parts of the closure and that Scott McCloud talks about, and it is actually the gutter. The gutter is this place between the panels. So it is this that is the magic of comics. For example, if you read here, McCloud says, "I may have drawn an X," being raised in this example here, but I'm not the one who let it drop or decided how hard to blow or who screamed or why. That, dear reader, was your special crime. Each of you committed it in your own style. All of you participated in the murder. All of you held the X and chose your spot. So we are invited to fill this gutter in between unconsciously of giving it the narration, of giving it meaning, actually, giving it closure. The other thing is that the time is really important in comics, and it's also important in drama. I'll turn to that. Comics turn time into space, and we can simultaneously see on single panel or single page, we can simultaneously see the past, the present, and the future. In movies, they are just in our short-term memory. Here, they are in front of them. Also, the important thing about, or important way of dealing with the frozen time is so-called bleeds. Those are panels or pages that have no ending. So we feel like the time is frozen inside. So this is, as you read, actually you go through space, but you also actually go through time as well. And these are unconnected moments, but by reading them, we mentally construct a narrative, a unified reality. Okay, so they are also excellent at eliciting emotional reactions, inducing empathy and identification, especially if we work with more abstract cartoon forms. We can identify really easily, unconsciously. This is important if you look at the trauma. Trauma creates a temporal rupture. It freezes time. It combines micro and macro narrative. In order to work through it or to engage it, you need empathy, you need emotional engagement. And this is what I think, and that's just not my opinion, other authors as well, is that comics really fit this narrative, let's say, this trauma, let's say, narrative, in the lack of a better word. Okay, so 3 examples, I will be able to probably go with 2. That have obvious similarities. First, they are all autobiographical. They were all written by women. They were all written by women who were born in the 70s and 80s. They lived most of their life outside their home country, to which they referred. They have family pasts in violent conflicts. and they combine these two narratives, familial, individual, and all three narratives, familial, individual, and collective. They all deal with the males in the family. This is an interesting gender, we can discuss it later probably. They deal with the father, the uncle, the grandfather, and all of them are potential perpetrators. It's not clear that they're it's a potential perpetration. They all deal with archival data. Okay, so let's go to, just a second, to Heimat. Okay, Heimat is a comic book that can be seen as an exploration of individual and Germany's collective identity, worked around the collective guilt and silence after World War II. So it's Nora Krug's work where she talks about her life as a person in Germany who grew up during the 80s and who, during her socialization processes and education, learned facts about Nazi regime and Holocaust. But as she says, we were never taught to ask about grandparents. We never learned about what happened in our hometown. And she struggled with this, with what we talked about, the crypt. Learning about the collective past, but never really learning about it. And she said, that, and this is her guiding question, we struggle to understand the meaning of Heimat, let's say homeland, in the lack of a better translation. And this struggle with collective identity spilled over to struggle about her own identity. How do you, and she asked, how do you know who you are if you don't understand where you come from? With all that encompasses, the positive and the negative. And this is interesting, she uses the wanderer above the sea in order to ask them. So on the left, first on the left, you see, this is her, in the main, it's Hitler, and that's a collective guilt and shame that she confronts all around. This, up there is the party of England. She's an exchange student from Germany, Hitler. And even at the fish market in Japan, completely separate experiences. Where are you from? Germany, Hitler. So this is her the way that she says, whenever I traveled abroad as a teenager, my guilt traveled, collective guilt traveled with me. And her Aunt Karen, she has a suggestion, just say you're from the Netherlands. And on the right, you see this wanderer over the sea, typical romanticism work. We can also discuss a bit about it later, why she chose it, and it's also, she draws herself as the wanderer, and that's the title page. But I'll skip to it for now. I have my own thoughts about it, but let's move on. Okay, so when she grew up, she said that she learned about the Holocaust, but she was left confused about it. Just a second. Sorry. We have she was less confused. I'll show you a picture of what later from the comic book. And even she says I had to later hide my accent because I felt the guilt. I even married a Jewish man, and still I felt guilty, as if that would bring some sort of I don't know acceptance of her own collective past. And she studied. She said, "Okay, I'll try to study Germany's history. I'll try to find out as much as I can about what happened." But it still wasn't enough. She still didn't feel like she excavated, let's say, the ghost in the crypt. So you see here on the left, just a short thing. They learned about the Holocaust, and then she had to draw in her at her school the Star of David, and at home her mother finds her cutting out the Star of David and wearing it on herself. And mother asked, "What are you doing?" And she said, I'm doing this out of the solidarity with the Jews." And she said, "I don't think that's a good idea," and stops there. And she said, I did my work confused. I wasn't sure what I did wrong. Why is that so wrong? And here you have an interesting way of, not even marrying a Jewish man has lessons by heart, and she is so, usually on weddings they are connected together, but here they are really, really far apart. And then she says, perhaps the only way to find the Heimat that I've lost is to look back, to move beyond the abstract shame and ask those questions that are really difficult to ask. About my own hometown, about my father's and my mother's families. To make my way back to the towns where each of them is from. To return to my childhood, go back to the beginning, follow the breadcrumbs, and hope they lead me way home. So this is actually, I mean, the abstract shame is the crypt, is the phantom. It's a feeling that is not her own. It's a feeling without the actual experience which warped her identity. The first step toward getting rid of the phantom is to open the crypt of silence, to look what's inside. And then, of course, later, we have to mourn it. We have to Billy have to, I'd say, cry over it in the lack of a better word. So the rest of the book is has two focal points. She wants to learn about her uncle Franz Karl and her grandfather Willy. Uncle Franz Karl died as a Hitler soldier. She has no memories of it. He died in 1944. And she has problems with mourning because she doesn't know how to work through it. She said, my uncle was a complete stranger to me. I didn't know anyone who had known him. War and death were the only things I associated with him. Because he had been one of Hitler's soldiers, I learned early on that I wasn't supposed to feel sadness over his premature death. And that's the problem of the mourning we talked about. Grandfather really is another situation. She has personal memories of him, and she has this family narrative that she begins to doubt is probably a post-war fantasy. So the idea, her aunt told her that Billy worked as a driver for a Jewish salesman before the war, and then the employer told him at one point that he has to go somewhere, leave, and he gave Billy, her grandfather, a large sum of money to thank him for the good relationship. And then Billy bought a car and served as a driving instructor for the army. And she begins to question, is that really what happened? I mean, I'm not sure. And then there's also a post-war fantasy that Billy is a quarter Jewish and stuff. And how does she do this? She goes into archives, family pictures, interviews with family members, documents, letters. I'm sure even later she goes to the town's archival and national archives, obsessing over it. And when you read it, there are completely accounts from page to page. This is sort of your, like, I call it a courtroom thriller. Someone says something, and then another person says completely different, and you're not sure what are the actual facts, what had actually happened. This is like a great, this is her uncle Billy, and his face is highlighted, he can't be identified completely. If someone were to ask me what kind of man my grandfather really was, whether he was quiet or exuberant, soft-hearted or severe, I wouldn't know how to respond, even though she remembers him. And then the face is filled when she finds out that he was actually a member of the Nazi party, even though the post-war fantasy of his familiar narrative was that he was a social democrat, that he never joined the Nazi party. And then he's identified. And you have this split of two people, actually one, that's a completely narrative. I think this is an interesting way to, like, he is also a social democrat, that's one narrative, but he's at the same time a Nazi party sympathizer or member. It looks like a cycle, yeah. And this is just to show you the way that the comic books has all these different drawings, all these different archival work and so on. She's really obsessed with the facts, in so much that she goes and she tries to identify from the map of the town where was Billy when Kristallnacht happened in her hometown. And then she points, aha, he was here. Could he see what was happening in the synagogue that was burned down? Was he there? And this is her trying to, let's say, to show how she is struggling with what really happened. She knows she cannot be sure. This is her saying, of course, you had to see what was happening. It was a small town, but were you actually there? And then she has 4 different possibilities. I was in another part of town, I was at home, I was in my office, or I was there when it happened. And it's a bit scary because that's the only one where he's smiling, which is also, we can discuss later probably. Or this, like Billy bought the car from the Nazi party, and she said perhaps other options were available, like A, B, C, D, but still you decided to buy that particular driving school from that particular person. Okay, so what's interesting, or what's interesting that confronting with this, or trying to find out with what really happened, opening the and so on, actually is forcing the second generation, her father, mother, aunts, to face the fate that they didn't face. For example, her father was a replacement child. He has the same name and surname as his brother who died in 1944. He was born in 1946. And he was always the bad child because he couldn't live with the ideal child who died in the war. This is her uncle, and they're really similar, and then she juxtaposes them over, saying that it's actually one person. But I don't want to go into the replacement child effect. It has been written a lot. This is an interesting position for me because now Krug is finding out about what happened to her grandfather, and she asks her aunt, like what was happening? How did you talk about it, about the war and so on? And she said, this is her aunt. Unfortunately, I don't know any more than what I told you. One of the things I've always struggled with is the fact that I was never able to get emotionally close to him, her father, not as her father, which is why I often get into fights. If he were still alive today, I would ask more questions because I want to understand why he was so withdrawn. But it's too late now. She didn't try to break the silence, or maybe she did, but she didn't confront it directly, as now the third generation is actually doing. And by confronting the third generation, she also asked the second generation to do their part, let's say. Okay, in the end, the group cannot establish any facts, but I think mourning was successful. She says Heimat can only be found again in memory, that it is something that only begins to exist once you lost. And she dedicates the book to her old and new family, as if she's saying, okay, I did this so you don't have to, my children don't have to work on the script anymore. So the book itself is artistically very interesting. It is basically as a scrapbook, as a high school journal more as a coming out of age journal on discovering adulthood. You read it as such. The book contains two repeatable things which are very interesting. This is how the book is. You have this photographs, you have this, her writing style is also really like childish and so on. But you have these repeatable things that she, it's like things German. For example, this is a mushroom that she talks about. It's something really German identity, going to the woods for the mushrooms. But it is only after that she talks about the Jew as the poisonous mushroom, which was the narrative of her uncle's story that she found. So it's always juxtaposed the clean, let's say, I don't know how to say it, some traditional German identity with what happened during the war. And the other thing is archival material. So she begins obsessively going to flea markets in Germany, buying things and then reproducing them as she bought them in the book. And this is interesting, the difference between the archives and the drawings. Eger talks about this as the difference between passive and active remembering. So archives and drawings are in a profoundly antagonistic relationship. If you put a photograph in your comic book, you're saying like this is the reality, this is what happened. If you're drawing, it's a more of an interpretive form that questions the image and explain to the truth. Especially interesting are redrawing of actual photographs. That is very important, and Petri says that it serves a narrative function that blurs the boundaries separating the documentary and the aesthetic. You're not sure if this is what really happened or is this the interpretation of the author. This can be seen as her where she tries to find out how did it really look like and what did he do at the war. So up there you have different ideas, really at the here, really there, and there are drawings. It's her imagination. But as soon as she finds out a photograph, it's put there, it's frozen in time, and then, like, it's the claim up there. This was her imagination. This was her imagination. This is the drawing. This actually didn't happen, but this happened. And this is here. It's a way to like sort of break through her working through to finding the facts. Okay, I have much time. How much? 10 minutes? When did we start?
12 minutes. You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. Okay.
We started at 9:35.
Okay. 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 I'll go to the second comic book. It's Sunday's Child. It's work by Selina Kat. It's a comic book that is basically a conversation between the author and her late grandfather. So what happened? Her grandfather was alive most of her life, and she really loved him. They had a good relationship. But after he died, she finds a photo album that introduces her to a grandfather I never knew, because he never talked about it. It's actually a photo album of his involvement in the Hitler Jugend, Hitler's youth. And so she's confronted with this struggle between the narrative and the experiences that she has with her grandfather, and this, as she said, what's happening beside the facade, because now her relationship becomes a facade. I want to know about the violence, about the fear, about the shame. And in order to do that, she says, I will have to invent things, add things, feel my way into your life, I will have to put words into your mouth, knitting together your version in English, that's his sister, creating my own version of history. She said, I cannot, she cannot ask him, he died. So what she does, she takes the photo album and tries to fill the narrative, trying to find out what actually happened, how did he feel in the Jugend and so on. So that's Gunther, that's her grandfather. He was a former aristocratic Polish family. They immigrated into Germany and so on. 1938, he joined the Jugend. He sent to military camps. He's this Sunday's child, always lucky. So he's immediately chosen as the leader. He's great at playing the violin. He's great as a gymnast. He's like this overall really successful child. But he's too young to go to war, even though he's a volunteer. They sent him back from the camp. He manages to survive the bombings. And then after he survives and starts to work at the bank after the war. So that's his life in short. And this is the way that the comic book looks like. I'm sorry I had to photo it because I'm not having it in PDF. So in the upper hand, you have the year, you have some, let's say, context or some words either from the author or from her grandfather, something that he told her. So this is here going to Hitler. And this is, I think this is post-memory par excellence. It's her trying to find out what happened, how did it feel. These are not her own memories, she's feeling them, trying to again, find out what happened, how did it feel. And she begins to question her grandfather as she moves on, as you read the comic book. So, for example, her grandfather says this is my first day of school, I'm allowed to draw all over the blackboard. Mother told me, the teacher, how much I love drawing. And then her questions start below. Like, were there really no children that disappeared overnight? Did you not notice some of your friends or some people from the neighborhood that disappeared? Or here, like this is a drawing of him in the military camp. She's like, they're preparing you for war, but still it feels like you felt good, right? Because you're part of the community. And I think the most interesting thing is at the end. At the end, she asks, okay, the war ended, life can begin anew, life can continue. But then she asks, but does it continue? Does life begin anew? And we have here her grandfather, we see him from the back, he's looking at Hitler's portrait, and we don't know if what he did. Was he scared? Was he happy? Was he enthusiastic about it? Did he cry? What is his relationship to the Nazi ideology? We cannot be certain, and she cannot be certain. She knows that he was a member of Hitler, but what happened after the war? Did life begin anew? Did her grandfather, was he shamed? Was he maybe had that ideology in him through the rest of his life, and so on? And this is especially interesting because this is the first page of the comic. This is the last one. It's sort of that she's telling us this is the indoctrination that happened there. But so this one comes after her question to her grandfather. And this is supposedly, I think, a quote from Hitler. I tried to find it, I'm not sure. He says, we will train them from an early age, and they will never be free again, not for the rest of their lives. They will never be free again could mean that her father was ashamed the rest of his life. He's never free from that experience. Or he's never free from the ideology, from that position. The indoctrination was excellent. So just a couple of things. This is really an interesting artistic comic book because there are no panels, there are no gutters. It doesn't look like a comic book. It looks like you're looking at a photo album, and there are no gutters, the space between. Each page is actually a single drawing. It's a sort of bleed. It bleeds all around the page. It feels like a moment frozen in time. You're confronted with these moments frozen in time. And the narrative is actually slowed down and at the same time sped up. It's slowed down because the situations are always slow. Nothing is happening very much. They're standing there. It looks like they're posing for the photograph. But at the same time, between those periods, here could happen. In 1933, the next page is 1935, and so on. I think this style mimics the Scherenschite or German paper cutting, like when they did. We can also discuss it. I don't know. It seems like it. And she uses different fonts for her words and her grandfather's words, but at a certain point they become blurry. You're not sure if this is her or if it's her grandfather. But I think the most important thing here is the redrawn photographs and artist drawing. You're not sure, she redraws, so this is, we're pretty sure this is her redrawing of actual photographs. But this cannot be, this is not an actual photograph, but it feels like it. So what she's asking us actually is something that she's struggling with, is like, you're not sure, is this reality or is this her imagination? Because she also cannot be sure what happened. So she's using this artistic idea of, you feel like you're watching photos all the time, but you're not sure are they actually photos. And for example, these are actual posters. I mean, they're translated, but they're actual posters. So you're not sure, are you going to her reworking of the memory or the actual photographs that have been redrawn. So this is an ambivalent position. It is up to the reader to conclude, does this mean simply, I read the wrong part. So I think this assignment cuts an ability to fully understand her grandmother's past. Also, the childish drawings that are there, I think, are there to increase empathy. I didn't show everything, but even the older people in the photographs, they are drawn a bit like children. It's like to point out that these were actually kids in the kids room. I want to skip further and just go to the back. I'm sorry. It should have been it should have been like really Catherine presentation. Okay, so I want to conclude by I tried to show a couple of examples that the way that this transgenerational trauma, dealing with the crypt, dealing with the phantom of the second generation, can be partly at least represented with comics, and how Eternal actually, she says the representational crisis is there. It's not that it cannot be represented at all. It can be partly represented, the traumatic experiences, they're dealing with the traumatic experiences, and she says the comic books are actually excellent for this. And I think there are deep connections with comics and trauma, especially with this sort of time and the imagination and the feeling of the narrative. And I'll just end with a big quote, but I think the quote will show what I think about all this. It's from Dominic Davis. It's 2020, the discussion about trauma and comic books. And he says, with their tendency to self-reflexivity and their interpellation of the reader as witness, comics are drawn, sometimes compulsively, to the documentation of the process by which trauma is socially constructed, publicly circulated, and retrospectively experienced. Whether by first-hand survivors, second-hand witnesses, or post-memory generation, which is what I talked a bit about today, comics are not formal mirrors that simply reflect dominant symbolic frameworks, established cultural narratives, or psychic symptoms, but are in fact a generative force at the core of trauma itself, molding and melding it into new shapes. By reviewing comics as a form that continually insists on producing new narrative models to negotiate, grapple with, and document trauma, these books and it looks to new ways in which it might be worked through in the future. So I have a feeling that, or at least I agree with this, that comic books can be an interesting way to approach these different, hard and maybe not dominant positions. For example, this transgenerational trauma of the children of perpetrators, which is like, again, I understand there are really a lot of ethical issues, but there are people in pain who, is it really their fault? So this is something we can also discuss. At the same time, I want to just point out that this is my last thought. All of these comic books have a negative relationship to the actual the negative things that their fathers, grandfathers, uncles did. It's not that neither of these comics is revisionist, that they agree. It's just a way to at first understand and then mourn the familial loss that was there. It's not their intention, at least, maybe someone could read differently, is not to find an excuse for the perpetrator. So okay, I'll stop here.